في غزة يسجى الشهيد فوق
يسجى الشهيد فوق الشهيد
يسجى الشهيد فوق الشهيد
يسجى الشهيد فوق الشهيد فوق
الشهيد فوق الشهيد فوق الشهيد.
في غزة يتراكم الدمار على الدمار على الدمار.
في غزة يموت البناء فوق البناء فوق البناء.
في غزة تختفي المعالم وتضيع الشوارع وتتلاشى الحارات.
في غزة تختلط الأشلاء
تختلط الأشلاء بالأشلاء
تختلط الأشلاء بالأشلاء
تختلط الأشلاء
بالأشلاء.
في غزة ينصهر الحديد، يذوب الفولاذ ويعجن الحجر.
في غزة لا شمس تشرق ولا قمر يعلو ولا ليل يخيم.
في غزة فأس يضرب وسكين يذبح وخنجر يلمع.
في غزة دم، في غزة دموع.
في غزة دم،
في غزة دم، في غزة دم.
في غزة دم، في غزة
دم، في غزة دموع.
في غزة دموع.
في غزة دم، في غزة دموع.
في غزة دم، في غزة دموع.
لكن غزة التي هي غزة تقاتل، فغزة هي النفق والضوء، هي الطريق وعلاماته، هي الرؤية وهي القيامة. غزة موعد الصبح وشوق اللقاء. غزة الصلاة والدعاء والرجاء، أنشودة الثائر وسلاحه. غزة فرح الأطفال وخجل الفتيات وضفيرة الشعر وقلادة العنق وسوار المعصم ووشم الحبيب. غزة وميض الفكرة التي كانت كما تلك التي ستكون. غزة الموعد وغزة اللقاء. غزة حدقة العيون وتوقها، بسملة القلوب ونبضها، رجاء النفوس ووعدها. غزة هي غزة وستبقى إلى ما بعد الزمان وما بعد المكان وما بعد ما بعد ما بعد كل ما كان أو ما يمكن له أن يكون أو سيكون. غزة هي غزة، وهي في أصل الحكاية الفلسطينية وغرسها الطيب وجذرها الأخضر وفرعه الباسق. غزة هديل الحمام وصهيل الجياد وكبرياء النسور وشاهقهم الذي لا يطال.
غزة قمر العالم وشمسه. غزة صليب الوجود ودرب جلجلته وعنوان قيامته ووعد خلاصه.
غزة لألأة النور وبريق العيون. غزة ابتسامة الثغور وجلجلة الفرح.
غزة قمح الأرض وخبز الحياة.
غزة غدنا القادم ووعدنا الذي انتظرناه.
غزة انتصار الأرض المؤكد وتحرر إنسانها وانعتاقه المؤزر.
غزة دمعتنا،
غزة شمعتنا،
غزة طلقتنا،
غزة لهفتنا،
غزة وعينا،
غزة سعينا،
غزة آيتنا،
غزة غايتنا.
وغزة تقاتل وتقاتل وتقاتل وتنتصر.
Good afternoon from Boston. This is Yasser Munif. Thank you for joining us today. I'm a member of the Global Prison Abolition Coalition, and I will be facilitating the panel with my colleague Özlem Goner. The panel is titled Palestine, Settler Colonialism and Abolition. Shortly after the Hamas attack, the Israeli government shut down the electricity, food, fuel supply, as well as the water, and began a systemic campaign of carpet bombing in most areas of the Gaza Strip, including hospitals, schools, mosques, and churches. Israeli violence on Palestinians did not start on October 7th, however. Its origin dates back at least to 1917, if not earlier. This genocidal Israeli violence is the culmination of more than 80 years of systematic violence that include displacement, ethnic cleansing, apartheid geography, military occupation, a colonial legal code, daily harassment and racism, assassination, cultural erasure, and indiscriminate killing. Israel is also a settler colonial state with an enormous security and prison system built to maintain its hegemony over the Palestinian population. This level of violence against Palestinians, both military and discursive, would not have been possible without a sustained campaign of dehumanization of Palestinians. I won't talk here about the Israeli genocidal rhetoric that was on display and has always been used by large segments of the Israeli population, which has become dominant since October 7th. The Israeli military and discursive violence are only possible because Palestinians are isolated. The Palestinian leadership, the PLO, has become the police and security of Israel. Arab dictators and monarchs are salivating at the idea that Palestinian resistance could finally be eradicated. And despite the violence and isolation, Palestinians are resisting the ground invasion in Gaza. They are resisting by existing. Despite the complicity of Western, Arab, and regional governments, the popular solidarity with the Palestinian is challenging Israeli supremacy and changing the balance of power, and is forcing these corrupt governments to take small concessions. We need an immediate ceasefire. Israeli war criminals, including Benjamin Netanyahu, must be prosecuted. The International Criminal Court has a mandate to bring these war criminals to justice. Apartheid, ethnic cleansing, and genocide must end, and Palestine must and will be free. So let me bring our panelist. Today's panel proposes an abolitionist lens to examine the history of settler colonialism, the ongoing genocide in Gaza, as well as the creative struggle of Palestinians. It explores the connections between US and European imperialism and the Israeli colonial project. The panelists will analyze the role of the Israeli prison and security industrial complexes in maintaining and reinforcing the colonial geography in Palestine. And they will discuss the abolitionist present and the possibility for an abolitionist future in Palestine. Özlem Goner will say a few words about our collective before we introduced our panelist.
Thank you so much, Yasser. Yeah, this just to let you all know that this panel is organized by the Global Prison Abolitionist Coalition, along with some other co-sponsors, including the Jewish Voices for Peace in Pittsburgh, Muslim Counter Publics Lab, Boston DSA, as well as the Emerson College Student Justice for Palestine. And I want to just say a word on the Global Prison Abolitionist Coalition and why this issue connects. So our coalition was formed around the highlight of the COVID-19 pandemic, which has given new urgency to abolish prisons, refugee camps, migrant detention centers, and inhuman, dehumanizing capitalist carceral system as a whole. And during this time, there have been many protests and hunger strikes inside detention centers and prisons in the US, Iran, Italy, Colombia, Mexico, Canada, India, Egypt, Kurdish prisons and Palestinian prisoners whose voices were completely shut from public we're all demanding an end to the carceral system. And that brought our coalition together, and it includes groups, organizations from various parts of the world. And we take this the end to prisons and prison carceral system as an entry point to a larger, a broader imagination of freedom and abolitionist politics. So welcome everyone. I'll now pass it to Yasser to introduce our panelists for today.
Thank you. Again, the title of the panel is Palestine, Settler Colonialism, and Abolition. And we are honored to have three outstanding, phenomenal panelists. So we will present them, and then we will start with the panel. Linda Kikivix is a daughter of undocumented migrant on the settler colony called California, and granddaughter of Maya Mam people of Ijmulu, and my apologies if I'm mispronouncing, you will correct me, Kiki. The land of maize, a Maya word split apart by the borders of modern plantation. Kikivix took a doctorate in geography from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, a certificate in Middle Eastern Studies from Duke University, and an Andrew Mellon postdoc fellowship in critical global humanities at Brown University. She is author of the forthcoming Palestine 1942, published by a community autonomous press. Cy Englert is a lecturer at Leiden University in the Netherlands. He is the author of Settler Colonialism, an introduction, and sits on the editorial boards of Historical Materialism and Notes from Below. Amr Saadeddin is a Palestinian activist and researcher. He has a PhD in political and social sciences from ULB and Louis Guido Carli. He published a book on the BDS movement, and he is the co-founder of Commoning Maashia for transformative learning. And Ryan is the ASL interpreter and block organizer for the Communist Party in the DC area, originally from Southern California. She works primarily with DC-based coalition and focuses in education and community organizing. And thank you for doing the ASL interpretation, which was proposed to us by the Muslim Counter Publics Lab. So thanks to them. Muslim?
Thank you. So we're going to have a number of questions on themes of Palestinian existence prior to Zionism, and I want to start there. And Amr, this question is to you specifically. Can you please tell us what Palestine was before Zionism? Could you describe the political, cultural, and social life in Palestine before the Zionist movement?
Yes, hello, thank you for receiving me. Usually such question about the history of Palestine is confusing to the colonized. We usually tend to prove that we have a viable history according to the lens of the colonizers. And we tend to demonstrate and search for signs of progress, of many aspects that the colonizer tries to challenge us, like either the Zionist ideology that denies even the existence of Palestinian people, or the European colonizers that claim and describe us that we were living centuries of backwardness under the Ottoman Empire. I think we should not fall in this trap. We should not prove that we have the same progress as described by colonizers, and as others said, like capitalism is not more advanced than feudalism. So progress the same token. The modernity, civilization, all of these descriptions are the Palestinian historians fell in trap to prove that we had the same descriptions in Palestine before 1948. So I think as the Israeli and European colonization should be resisted, it also needs to be challenged, deeply challenged in cultural terms, because colonization is, of course, for economic and political reasons, and also for cultural reasons. For example, Christian Zionism before Jewish Zionism even. So I would quickly describe a few points about the history of Palestine before 48. Like the nationalist-centered history doesn't trace history of Palestine until the European Jewish immigration to Palestine, starting in 1882, as if history started with colonization. It is obviously a Eurocentric and Zionist history of Palestine, where, for example, the Palestinian historian Mshara Doumani has challenged, for example, Palestinian exports of agricultural products or processed industries of wheat, barley, sesame, olive oil, soup, or cotton to European regions before 1882 was greater than European imports to Palestine and balanced a bit the deficit in the trade of Greater Syria with Europe. Yet the trade was linked to social and economic links inside in the region of Palestine, Bilad al-Sham or Greater Syria then. But like, for example, my city Nablus was also called Little Damascus, demonstrating these links with Salt in East Jordan, with Tripoli in North Lebanon. So there were all of these dynamics before the start of direct colonization in Palestine. But I don't mean to concentrate on trade and agribusiness. On the contrary, I think self-sufficiency agriculture was the dominant mode, also a type of agriculture that was doomed as pre-modern, which is the type of activity that is not linked to money and profit. It was linked, and this is, I think, the most important, to collective and communal practices, collective and communal knowledges and arts. Olive picking, wheat harvesting, building houses were major examples of communal practices, also linked to, like, for example, dabke dancing and its music. Modern schools, as we have always challenged that colonization brought this education, modern progressive education has not been majorly bringing better knowledge. They have brought knowledge mainly for the purpose of punishment, fear, competition, individualism, private property, and fragmentation between the different peoples in the society, segments in the society. The olive tree is a whole word for Palestinians. Until now, in our daily narrative, when we see an olive tree, we feel humble before this tree. As the Palestinian poet Murid Barghouti describes it, it is the olive with its diverse types, where some types date back to 1,000 years, and olive oil that is a major daily cuisine eaten in almost every dish, and the nucleus of the olive is not thrown but used for heating. When burning it, the remnants of the olive oil is used in manufacturing soup. So olive oil was used as barter systems of exchange. It is the economy of whole communities and deeply part of their culture. And we have this famous photo of a woman hanging an olive tree. She is Mahfouza from Salem village, South Nablus. And she was just defending her tree that she talks about it as her son. Against these massacres of olive fields by Israeli colonizers, which really put the contrast. What sort of people are they? Like they cut olive trees, like dating back to hundreds of years, which is in a way reflect who's rooted in this land, apart from the fascist ideology. So the privatization of land brought by colonization, capitalist colonization, was a major blow to these communal practices in Palestine, where it ended in large pieces of land in the hands of few had a devastating effect on peasants as well, or selling of land to Jewish settlers by Palestinian, Lebanese, or Syrian feudalists at the time. It also had a devastating effect on the Palestinian resistance leadership before 1948, though there were continuous revolutions and sacrifices in 1921, 1929, 1936 to 1939, and during the 1947 and 48 war. The fragmentation of leadership composed of elites in competition was drastic as well. Palestine was also a place with no borders. It is historically part of the surrounding area of Bilad al-Sham, Greater Syria, though it was called Palestine since long time. Also, it is a place that known for centuries coexistence between three major religions, Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. Of course, as in any society, sometimes there are some tensions, but they were not drastic and not by any means compared to the ethnic cleansing of Israeli colonization or even the bloody invasion by the Crusades. And the history also of Palestine before 1948, like I think I exceeded my time, so maybe going on later.
Thank you, Amar. And we can, go back to this question from different perspective and later. So I will ask Sai the following question: how should we understand the long history of colonization and settler colonialism, and where does the history of Palestine fits within that framework?
Yeah, thank you so much, Yasser, and also, of course, Özlem and the Global Prison Abolition Coalition for organizing this event, for inviting me. It's a real honor and a pleasure to be here and to share this session with everybody else. I think it's an important question because I think there's perhaps a danger that as there is more attention given to settler colonialism in public and political discourse, there's a danger that it becomes, I think, disconnected from wider histories, other histories, and broader structures of control, exploitation, oppression, etc. And so I think it's important to start by locating the long history of colonialism in the long history of capitalism, which is to say that I think colonialism has played a key role in the transition that Amr just mentioned, and that perhaps also helps us think more critically about this idea of a progressive trajectory of history marching towards kind of modernity in a way that is too often uncritically celebrated, and played a central role in making capitalism possible by accumulating on a world scale land, natural resources, labor, etc. Of course, first and foremost centered on Europe, although of course different centers of accumulation developed in the kind of long 500-year history of colonial expansion. I think within that, settler colonialism has a particular history, which is a history not only of control, conquest, and extraction, as we might think of if we think of franchise colonialism, right? So if we think of the British in India or the Dutch in Indonesia, although settler colonialism is also that, it is also conquest, control, and extraction, but it is conquest, control, and extraction made possible through the implementation of a colonial population in the territory that is being controlled, and that therefore also generates, I think, different social relations of continuous conflict between settler and indigenous population for control over land, labor, and resources. And I think settler colonialism played a number of roles throughout this kind of long history, many of which are important, I think, to understand the history of Palestine and the present of Palestine as well. One of them is, I think, until much later in Europe's colonial history, so until the kind of 19th century, Europe does not have the kind of military and economic superiority that allows it to conquer and control territory in the way that it does by the late 19th century. And so the presence of a continuous population that is not only a civilian population, but also a military population that can maintain the colonial presence on the territory that has been conquered permanently is extremely important. And in fact, until the 19th century, settler colonialism is considered classical colonialism. So, for example, in the debates between Marx and Gibbon in the 19th century, they refer to classical colonialism to talk about settler colonialism as opposed to franchise colonialism that is developing in that period. The second point, which is connected to that, is that settler colonialism played an important role in maintaining control, particularly in key strategic points in the empire. And so if we can take a kind of a classic example, perhaps, can you still hear me? I see myself frozen, but I don't know.
Yeah, we can.
If you can still hear me.
We do hear.
Yes, okay. And okay, great. I hope the camera returns. Okay, amazing. So I think it played an important role in controlling key strategic points in the empire. And so again, this question of not thinking of settler colonialism as isolated from wider networks of accumulation. And so, for example, I was going to give the example of South Africa being a key trading point.
We lost Sai, so we will maybe bring Kiki. And Oslam will ask.
Right, we'll get back to Sai after. So Kiki, your forthcoming book is about Palestine and 1492. Why is 1492 relevant in the Palestinian context, and how should we understand the long history of colonization in the region and beyond? Like, where does Palestine fit in this long history of colonialism?
You know, when we study the Palestinian resistance, so many of us come away with the understanding that this is so much bigger than just that corner of Mother Earth, and that it's a problem of the world. And I think that right now, many more people are seeing it, that it's a problem when they say, you know, the world has forgotten about us. there's I think a sharper understanding now that there's a world and there's an above and a below, because so much of the below is with Palestine, and it's the above that is against Palestine. So much of my work in trying to study the Palestinian resistance, and in particular as a geographer, looking at the history of how the borders there were cut, already being suspicious of borders, having communities that I come from having to cross borders that didn't exist before. Just like how Amr was talking about with Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Palestine, Egypt, all being fragmented from each other when these borders were cut, and cut by Europeans. So 1492 is a moment of the birth of this kind of global linear thinking that cuts the world up into borders. So when I was studying a genealogy of how Palestine got her modern borders, because Palestine's been there forever, but just because she's not a state doesn't mean that she didn't exist, which is really disturbing discourse that's out there, that since there was no Palestine state, there was no Palestinians, as if states are natural. They're actually new inventions. Nation states are new inventions from empire. So 1492 looks at how this got started globally. And it doesn't begin with October 12th. It begins with January 2nd, which is the surrender of Granada in the Iberian Peninsula at the hands of Queen Isabella's military. And that was the last Muslim stronghold in the Iberian Peninsula after Muslims had been there for centuries. And so it was a great feat for Christendom. Isabella's a Catholic monarch, and it was a holy war. And what happened was it was the final ethnic cleansing of the Iberian Peninsula from Muslims, and the heightened persecution of Jews, of anybody who was different than who the Catholic monarchs believe that everyone should be. So it's this rupture point when Europe is understood, modern Europe is understood as having been created through this ethnic cleansing, through the imposition of one world Catholicism on everyone, forcing Jews to convert or leave. And then, of course, having the Inquisition, having tortured so much of what happened in Europe, slavery, torture, the burning of books, that took place before it happened to us here on these lands. It was already a sensibility, a worldview that was being battled out in Europe, because as with the world, there's a Europe from above and a Europe from below that's always been resisting. It's just that at different moments, the above becomes more intensified than the below. But what happens with 1492 is, and Columbus is actually in Granada, waiting for Granada to surrender before he can tell Isabella his plan to sail west. And it was to get Jerusalem next. Of course, not knowing that we were here and he would encounter the peoples here on these lands on October 12th. That would be the Taino people from the Caribbean who he would enslave and genocide right away. And immediately the European powers, Portugal and the Spanish, the soon-to-be Spanish monarchs, Castile and Aragon, start to fight over who these new territories will belong to. And the Pope steps in so that the Europeans don't fight and draw a line. And he draws a line, an arbitrary line cutting the world, where the newfound lands are, and tells the Spanish monarchs that they can invade everything west, which is why in the Americas so much of the west speaks Spanish, and the Portuguese east, which is why Brazil speaks Portuguese, and so much of Africa and Asia was colonized by Portugal. And that line then leads to other lines. In the Americas, the viceroyalties are cut. That then become the nation states that we know of today, Mexico and Guatemala, Peru, Colombia, and of course the British come and they do something similar here on these lands, genocide and ethnic cleansing, which comes through erasure and dehumanization. So really what 1492 is a story of how, and I try to tell it through maps, there's so many ways to tell it, but as a geographer, that's how I was able to track this story of how 1492 relates to Palestine, is that maps have allowed such a violent process of erasure and dehumanization to be produced in everyday people's minds and hearts. So to be a settler on colonized lands, to be just someone trying to live your life, which sadly is what happened with a lot of people that Europeans were oppressing, including Jews in the Iberian Peninsula. Many of them were told, hey, you know, there's land over there in the new colonies. They were told this also in places where capitalism was enclosing the common lands, destroying the common lands and making them into private property, which would then happen to Palestine too, and of course happen to us here. As people were resisting this, they were being told that there's land in the new colonies. And so then the oppressed become the oppressors of others simply in trying to make their lives. And sadly, this is the one and only option that exists in that world of empire, in that world built by 1492, is that there's an above and a below. The above makes their lives on top of the below, extracts from the below. And in order to not die in this war of extermination, of death and destruction, the one option we have is to go above. But then that means crushing others. So that has been, for me, I think, an easier way to understand that great paradox that so many of us have heartbreak over, about how victims of the Nazi Holocaust, how our Jewish relatives could become the oppressors of others, could possibly in their name genocide others, like what's happening right now in Palestine. And it didn't have to be that way. There were so many different debates happening among the Jewish liberation movement at the time, but the one that we know of now, the one that became strong, and we're trying not to make so strong, is the one that asks your own oppressor if you could please have a place in the world, a seat at the table, and not be on the quote unquote menu. And it understands that those are the only options of the world, when in fact there are other ways of being, living side by side rather than above and below, respecting each other's differences rather than trying to impose one way of being, which has been the imposition of the world of 1492. But I'll leave it at that for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Kiki. That's a fascinating history. Amr, so I would like you to talk a little bit about the Arab governments and the regional governments and the role in colonization of Palestine and the subjugation of Palestinians.
Yes, like it was not only Palestine that was subject to colonization by the British, but the whole region was subject to this colonization before 100 years. So if to and the resistance in Palestine was linked to the resistance of other peoples in the region against colonization. And for example, Qassam was Syrian. Now the military wing of Hamas having the name of Qassam, he was a Syrian resisting French colonization in Syria. And then resisting the British colonization of Palestine. So this is from below the resistance. But during this resistance, for example, in 1936, where there was a long general strike in Palestine, against the British occupation and its policy to give Palestine to Zionists. Like the three major kings, Arab kings, sent letters to the Palestinian leadership asking them to end the general strike, which was continuous for 6 months, because, as they said, our British friends promised us in good faith to settle the issue. And if you look now, we have the same dynamic. These Arab dictators are still going to the US now, that took the role of the UK, begging them to do something. Our friends, please do something. If they have good intentions, because some of them really, as you said, Yasser, they want to get rid of resistance in Palestine, because this resistance is also linked to the popular protests in the region. It has always been linked to the protest against these regimes in the region. So to sum it up, the region was, since 100 years, is under colonization. And what the 7th of October made it clear for us that it is still under a renewed form of colonization, because we see no Arab state taking practical step towards ending this genocide in Gaza or in West Bank. So there were an attempt basically in the 60s to challenge this colonization, but it was defeated by Israel in 1967 war. And this is why the US saw in Israel as a major and strategic ally, and adopted Israel to serve the US colonial interests in the region.
Thank you. And clearly, I hear you saying that there is no decolonization in Palestine without decolonization in the Arab in the region, Arab world.
Yes.
Thank you, Amr and Yasser. So I will continue on that question of colonialism and settler colonialism, this time with Sai. And the question to you, particularly, Sai, because you studied these contexts, is how is the settler colonialism in Palestine comparable to the United States and Canadian settler colonialism? And Kiki already gave us hints on this, but I guess we can continue that discussion some more to understand the parallels of oppression and colonization, and also differences some more.
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, if I can come back first to my previous answer, I'm so sorry that I got cut out, but so because I think it helps us think comparatively. Right. So I think there's sort of three roles that settler colonialism played. One was control over land. One was control over key strategic points in global networks of trade and accumulation. And so I was giving the example of the Cape in South Africa, which is settled by the Dutch in order to control a key nodal point in world trade for the trades of European merchants towards Asia, and the kind of settlement of a population there that can defend the port over the long term against indigenous resistance. And the third one is to resolve internal social contradictions within the metropole. And so the kind of the undesirables could be sent out of Europe, whether for political, religious, which were often one and the same, social reasons. And in the process of being sent away, they could both be gotten rid of for the European powers and advance the colonial project abroad. And here already, I think we have an important connection between settler colonies in North America and Zionism in Palestine, which is that the so-called pilgrims, who were the pilgrims? I teach in Leiden, where the pilgrims left from. There's a lot of very uncritical celebration of the pilgrims all over the town. American presidents come regularly to celebrate the history of the pilgrims in Leiden. The pilgrims were a religious minority that was oppressed in England, that fled to the Netherlands, where it was able to organize for a while until the Netherlands signed an agreement with the British to fight the Spanish, at which point the Dutch turned on them as well. And there was a split within the religious community where half of them decided to settle North America. And what you see there, I think, is exactly that process, which is to say that you have an undesirable group that was opposing the English crown that European powers didn't want in Europe. But by moving to North America, they became the vanguard of European colonial expansion. The same is, of course, true for the Zionist movement, which is that the way Zionism worked is that it was able to say two things to the European powers, and most importantly, the British, who ended up sponsoring it, which was, on the one hand, we will help you control a key crossroads in world trade that brings together Asia, Europe, and Africa, that controls one side of the Suez Canal, that at the time was the outcome of the oil pipelines to the British oil pipelines that came from what is now northern Iraq to Haifa. And at the same time, you can get rid of the Jewish populations in Europe that you don't want in Europe. And so that's very striking, is that the Zionist movement repeatedly appeals to the anti-Semitism of the British and other European ruling classes by saying it's a win-win situation. You get a control of this key strategic region, and you can get rid of the Jewish population. So Balfour, who famously gives his support, famously gives British support to the Zionist movement, is a famous anti-Semite who had written a law in 1905, the Aliens Act, barring Eastern European Jews from migrating to Britain. So there already we have this kind of comparison, I think, that is helpful, which is how to get rid of undesirables, quote unquote, at home by expanding colonial control over key areas of the world economy. There are, of course, also differences. And I think one of the differences is the relationship with the indigenous population, which is that the United States were much clearer, the British in the United States and then in Canada were much clearer on, or at least much more able over, of course, a longer period of time to eliminate a potential dependence on indigenous labor within the economy of their settler colonies. And they did so by enslaving African populations and by bringing over large amounts of poor Europeans to fill the industry. The Zionists had similar hopes, and that's the Nakba, right? Kicking out the Palestinians in order to build a state that would not be dependent on the labor of indigenous Palestinians, unlike, for example, the settler colonies in South Africa and Algeria that were dependent on indigenous labor. But the Zionists were never quite as effective. And I think the contradiction is one that is playing itself out in Gaza now. Where does the genocidal impact or impulse come from in Zionism? It's exactly that desire to get rid of the Palestinians, because the Zionist movement from the early 1920s makes very clear, as long as we continue to integrate the indigenous population within the state that we are trying to build, they will continue to rebel and fight back, and we therefore have to get rid of them. And I think that's very much the struggle that we're seeing in front of us. And that comparison, I think, helps us make sense of it.
So important. Yasser, back to you.
Thank you so much, Sai. And it is true that this concept of settler colonialism has been used by historians in the context of Palestine for several decades now. But now it has become much more popular among people. who support Palestine and want to understand what's happening. So back to you, Kiki, and I want to dig a little bit more into your project. Could you talk a little bit about the long history of maps that you mentioned earlier in the context of the Palestinian and Israeli context and the political implications? Why are the maps important, and why did you choose to use the maps to tell that story?
Following from 1492, when the lines are cut as contracts between Europeans over their borders that they're going to respect as they're invading and pillaging and exploiting and genociding, enslaving. There is the cutting up of the Americas, and then there's the cutting up of Europe internally as nation states, homogenizing Europe, which becomes a frightening situation if you're not going to fit into this idea of who is French or who is German and who's British. And sadly, our Jewish relatives didn't fit in. And so we saw another increase of anti-Jewish hatred, anti-Semitism in Europe. And then this is the impetus for political Zionism to create that nation state for Jews where they can be a majority. And like, Sai pointing out, like there's this pattern among Europe to export its problems out, export out its contradictions, and make their contradictions useful to them somehow. And the way that was marketed to the British was that they would be, that Zionism, that a Jewish state would be an outpost of civilization in a quote unquote sea of barbarism, as a military base, as a fort. And so what we get is, with the cutting up of Europe, we also then get the cutting up of Africa. And that takes place in Europe, in Berlin, by the Germans, so that they could have some empire too. They want to get in on it. They had just unified, quote unquote, became a nation state in the 1870s. And so by the 1880s, they're hosting a conference with the imperial powers in Berlin to cut up a map of Africa peacefully so that they don't fight about these new conquests. And of course, it has nothing to do with the realities on the ground or the desires of communities living there. And then that happens in the next few decades in what becomes the Middle East, or what we know as the Middle East, so Eastern Mediterranean with the Levant and Iraq all the way to Kuwait. And so that this and very secret, the Sykes-Picot Agreement between the French and the British and other European powers that create these borders, which again are just contracts between who is going to administer what, who's going to have what be their property, but again, just between the above. And so then Palestine's borders in 1923 are cut between the British and the French, the modern borders that we know of today, that very iconic shape of Palestine. And immediately the Zionist movement starts to erase the Arabic names of place names and puts it the Hebrew names. So here's the erasure part. So then in the popular imagination, and because maps have a way of speaking to them as being neutral, scientific, and true, it makes it so that people believe that there were no Palestinians there. And in the decades, in the years right after 1948, and in particular the decades of the 60s and 70s, when we saw a lot of the Palestinians in the camps outside of Palestine leading off the resistance, we see a lot of use of that iconic map, which seems paradoxical because that shape was created by colonial imperatives. But then here is how movements then can, they turn, and Palestinians are pretty masterful at doing this, like turning what the colonizer wants to throw at it, and then throw it back at them in resistance. And that's what the map of Palestine has done for 75 years, serve as an icon to rally resistance, to create this community of resistance, because everybody inside those borders, from the river to the sea, didn't matter whether they knew each other or not, or how different they were before. Every single one is marked for extermination, every single community there, between the river and the sea, the Palestinian communities are marked for extermination. And so that map, they use it as a counter map. And so a lot of the Palestinian resistance in the 60s and 70s was very popular. It was also based in camps and also armed. And then later we see the Intifada in the West Bank and Gaza in the late 80s, which then leads to, sadly, the peace process, the Oslo peace process, which was just a process of peace for Israel. And then that's where maps start to change, particularly from the politicians and the above. So Palestinians have an above and a below as well, like elitists, those who are with the regimes, the Arab regimes, and with empire, and wish to be empire's handmaiden in the region, except to replace Israel. Like, that's Palestine from above. The Palestine from below, particularly the refugees, if you go to refugee camps, you see graffiti everywhere of the Palestine iconic full map. You don't see just Gaza and the West Bank, which is how the maps changed with 1993 and the Oslo peace process from above. The above would only map the maps of Gaza, Palestine with Gaza and the West Bank. But the refugees continue mapping all of Palestine and have been able to subvert a lot of the conversation by counter mapping in that way. And something that points out in terms of like in following the life of the map in the Palestinian resistance and how the maps from above and the maps from below differ, what we see over the last 30 years, which has been of great, of course, controversy and heartache for a lot of Palestinians, is the co-optation of their leadership to be with empire. And so what happened at that moment of Oslo forward is that popular resistance from below, everyday life, that power circulating among communities, mutual aid, as we call them in some circles, that gets transferred to the above, where now it's the politicians and the technocrats, the cartographers who are going to supposedly free Palestine. And they focus so much on the border. Give me the border, the Palestinian leadership would tell the Israelis in the negotiations. Give me the border, it will solve everything, which is not true because it wouldn't solve the refugees returning, for example. But Israel refuses to define its border with Palestine. I don't know of any other country who has not defined its borders yet. Israel is not done expanding. But what I argue is that Israel already has its border with Palestine, and it's that line between the human and the non-human that has been created with 1492 globally as the European and the non-European. So that is the border between Israel and Palestine. And if we can make that clearer, and I think that October 7th is making that very, very clear, that allows us a way out to stop working in this cycle of death, of going above and then crushing others and repeating that master-slave back and forth, master-slave dialectic, and going out and creating new relations. So I think that the history of maps, the way that they've changed, and also following how they're deployed by Palestinians from above, from below, in the different ways, can tell us a lot about how they understand resistance and also ways forward for us to walk with them along that path.
Thank you, Kiki. Really, really fascinating. I think we could spend an entire panel discussing the question of the maps, the violence of the maps, the power of the maps, and the fascinating idea of the border separating or separating the human from the non-human. I think there is a lot of food for thought here. Let me bring back all the panelists, and we're going to ask questions to all of you around different themes.
Thank you. Thank you, Kiki. Also, I want to start there because you already introduced our next theme, which is this theme of resistance. And you started talking about the counter mapping as a form of resistance. So I would like to ask Amr and Sai to talk a little bit more about the Palestinian resistance in its different forms, in its multitudes, with its different actors, and the current possibilities and maybe future of this resistance, where you see that taking place. Amr, should we start with you and then Sai?
Yes. Like resistance has always been diverse, even now in Gaza. We have the military resistance, but where the Israeli army is not only trying to crush the military resistance, it is before that it started to crush the civilians, because just the existence of civilians is resistance in itself, and this is why Israel was always trying to bring Palestinians from Gaza City and North Gaza to the south. And until the ceasefire latest one, or the only one, there were, according to reports, like 700,000 Palestinians still remaining in Gaza and North Gaza, which is, I think, very surprising for people to steadfast despite these horrible crimes on daily basis. So this is an example of how, and the military resistance cannot do anything if their relatives, their neighbors leave them, the civilians. But obviously many would question, and everyone I think has the question, does it deserve it to have all of these casualties because of military? And in this sort of settler colonial genocidal, this is what also a bit different from the colonization of Algeria and South Africa. It is like the colonization of the Americas, because it is genocidal for elimination, completely or partially. So there is no other option but to resist in all available means. And at that moment, on 7 October, the resistance chose this mean. Because it came after years of sieging Gaza, this concentration camp. Workers were demonstrating; they were killing them. The Israeli soldiers. You had all of these previous forms of resistance, from peaceful strikes to stones. And you had the surrender, like Oslo Agreement is in a way, is a sort of surrender by the PLO. And what we saw after this even surrender, that Israeli settlement in the West Bank exploded. So it means that there is no other way except resistance, including military resistance. Of course, there is, and I would finish here. Of course, it has been always the dialogue of the division between the Palestinian people that is imposed, but also internalized. So this is a challenge to unite resistance, but in any way, according to a report I read, there are 10 factions now resisting in Gaza. So it is what we usually hear in media is Hamas and Jihad, the Islamic Jihad. But according to one report I saw, there are 10 factions, and they did a maneuver before 7 October. On 7 October, like the 10 different factions.
Thank you. Sai, would you like to add more on that theme of resistance in its different forms, various forms, the possibility of unity, or also uniting the resistance?
Sure. I mean, I don't think I have anything to add specifically to what Ahmed has just said now, which I absolutely agree with. I would just maybe say two things. One of them is I think that what Ahmed was mentioning about Oslo, I think is important because I think for a while now we've seen its collapse in lots of different ways, which has very important political consequences, I think, for the forms of resistance that we're seeing. And if the idea was that Palestinians could be kept in different Bantustans while colonization expands, and while the Palestinian leadership is caught in a dead end of sort of begging the international community to allow it at some point, maybe in the future, if it behaves properly, to receive a part of a state on a little bit of land, maybe. And of course, Gaza was the most horrible, and still is the most horrible representation of that concentration of 2.3 million Palestinians behind barbed wire, regularly bombed, cut from sufficient food, water, electricity, etc., etc., etc. And the 7th of October, I think, is one of the many expressions of the untenability of that status quo, of the fact that Israel's idea that it can continue to concentrate Palestinians on less and less and less land while expanding its colonialism more and more is untenable and will continue to explode in its face in lots of ways, including what we saw on the 7th. But I think there's been lots of other signs of that. And I think one of them, which is really important, is that for the last decade, we've seen lots of different forms of Palestinian resistance that has extremely clearly rejected a number of the kind of key tenets of that Israeli strategy. They've rejected the idea of limited statehood. They've rejected the idea of the separation of Palestinians in different islands in the West Bank, in Gaza, in 48, in the diaspora, the refugees. They've rejected the kind of the divisions and the structures that are imposed on them. And so I think if we look at the Great March of Return in Gaza in 2018, if we look at the youth movement or the Talat movement, or which was a feminist movement across historic Palestine, or the general strike that we saw in May 21, or even before the kind of the social movements in the West Bank against the Palestinian Authority, all of those are independent of existing factions. All of those recognize Israel as a colonial oppressor over the whole of historic Palestine and all of its people. And all of those is spoken about anti-colonial liberation from the river to the sea. And I know we'll say perhaps a little bit more about that in a moment. But all of that, I think, is extremely important because it points to the fact that what Israel and its international allies thought was the kind of effective control that it would impose on Palestinians by dividing them and isolating them from one another has crumbled in lots of different ways, and that the kind of new forms of Palestinian political organizing are pointing to new ways of uniting across the kind of the colonial divisions. And to that, we should perhaps also think of kind of regional processes and unities that are taking place in front of our eyes as well now. But I'll shut up for now.
Thank you, Amr. Thank you, Sai. So, Kiki, we discussed earlier the connection between settler colonialism in Palestine and the Americas. I'd like to go back to that question of settler colonialism. Do you think that indigenous struggles are at the forefront of resistance against the latest phase of authoritarian neoliberalism? Or is that an overstatement?
It depends on how we're using that word indigenous. A lot of the time, the word indigenous is used as just as a label or as an identity of who's been on a certain corner of Mother Earth before European colonization. And in fact, that word indigenous is part of the colonial lexicon to talk about who the non-European is, and also to talk about who is closer to nature and so isn't quote unquote fully human or fully man, because within Western philosophy, political theory, metaphysics, even spirituality, at least the dominant forms that empire carries, because of course there's so much difference in Europe too. There is the idea that there is a human and the non-human split, which I referenced earlier, and that non-human is Mother Earth, and it's anyone who doesn't have those types of rights, whether it's the quote-unquote terrorist or the enslaved person. Before it was a communist, even before that it was anarchist. And so if we're talking about indigenous peoples who understand ourselves to be part of nature with the land, and it's really nice and refreshing, Amr, to listen to you talk about Palestine before 48 and the olive trees, because so much of the time previously, particularly with the discourse from the Palestine of above, we wouldn't hear about olive trees as family members. We would hear about olive trees as private property that's being destroyed by Israel, kind of like appealing to the sacred of the West, which is private property. And what we would lose a lot, and what we have lost, and it's nice that it hasn't been lost, and it's growing even, is this understanding of Palestinians and as indigenous peoples who are not separate from Mother Earth, who understand themselves like indigenous people. So if we're using that term indigenous in that way, rather than how Zionists are using it right now, for example, to talk about Jews as indigenous, except that they're destroying the land. So like, how does that, how do we square that up? If we're talking about indigeneity of being as refusing that superior, inferior, human, non-human binary, then yeah, indigenous movements have a great leadership role to play. And in particular, and I don't mean, again, just specifically the identity of indigenous, but the being of indigenous. There are so many theorizations coming out of indigenous movements about what's going on in the world, and something so relevant is the analysis that the Zapatistas in Chiapas give us about the Fourth World War. They talk about that we're in the Fourth World War already, and we've been in the Fourth World War, and we already did the Third World War. The Third World War was a so-called Cold War, which was only cold between the Europeans, but it was hot in Central America, Central Africa, Asia, and that was a war between states, and it had its specific characteristics of war. But now we have, with the fall of the Soviet Union, whereas before it was a fight between the First World NATO, Second World USSR, and then the Third World had to pick, right? And again, it's picking one world, right? The One World project of 1492 continues under that framework. With the fall of the Soviet Union, supposedly the world of Capital One, and it's acting like it. So now we have a total global war of capital against life, where it's not so much about states versus states. They're all under the logic of global capital. So sovereignty has shifted away from states as sovereign, and they are just managers, administrators of the global plantation of global capital. So with those kinds of theorizations, I think that it can help us tell new stories and figure out what next. Like what is it that we're fighting? What is it that's fighting us? And so I do believe that indigenous movements, but depends on how we're using that word, as long as we're not destroying Mother Earth, as long as we're fighting for life, which includes our lives, human lives, Homo sapiens lives, and the rest of life that makes our lives possible, then yeah, that I believe that that's the struggle, because the enemy of this Fourth World War is humanity, is life, and it is just going to destroy, extract, reshape territory for that extraction of profit, which is an extraction of power, an extraction of energy, in order to be able to continue reshaping the world.
Thank you so much, Kiki. So much to unpack as with everything here, and this indigenous notions, alternatives, and an abolitionist vision right there, right? This notion of us just being other living creatures of this world that we all share, as someone commented in the chat. And from that, I think we also, in this most recent internationalist solidarity with Palestine, if we can tackle that question, that we've seen some rise of the people for Palestine, and sometimes at the expense of, right, all the states sponsoring, complicit, or just downright giving the money for Israel's genocide. We also have many people, young people on the streets at unprecedented degrees everywhere in the world, of people rising up for Palestine, and importantly chanting the slogan of "from the liver to the sea," Sai, which you mentioned earlier. And I want to ask you to talk more on that internationalist solidarity from the ground, and also what this particular slogan, how it appeals to people, and why it has been being banned by the states.
Yeah, thanks so much. I mean, I first of all absolutely agree with your characterization of the moment, which I think we're in a very striking moment where, on the one hand, we are seeing the kind of the doubling down of our regimes, and I think in a sense we can draw that line both, as Amr was mentioning before, the regimes in the region itself, and our own in Europe and in North America, etc., that are continuing to support Israel, and in fact surrounding it. I mean, I've used the image of a sort of a regional Sabra and Shatila that we are seeing for the moment, right, where Israel surrounded the Lebanese militias as they carried out the massacres in 82 in the Palestinian refugee camps, and in a sense that's what we're seeing on a regional level, right? The United States, Britain have sent warships, troops, Germany and the Netherlands have troops stationed in Cyprus, literally surrounding Israel, protecting it in case somebody was to intervene to stop the genocide in Gaza, in order to allow it to kind of carry it out as peacefully as possible. And against that, what we are seeing are incredible mobilizations by workers, by students, by young people, by old people, by anti-racist movements, by all sorts of popular coalitions that we're seeing take to the streets now. I think really crucially, the beginning of industrial action being taken by dockers in Barcelona, refusing to touch military material passing through their docks. Belgian workers refusing to do the same in their airport. We saw the blockades in the ports in the United States. I mean, really important kind of solidarity actions. And I think what we're seeing there is also the way in which solidarity works. Solidarity is not charity. Solidarity is to recognize that our struggle in solidarity with the Palestinians is also a struggle about freeing ourselves, about democratizing our own states, about taking control over what we think the world should look like, and what our states are doing. And I think what's striking is that the Zionist project, whether it comes from Israel or whether it comes from our own governments, has lost the battles for hearts and minds, and I think has stopped trying to wage it. Is that it has turned really to repression in an attempt to put the genie back in the box. So we're seeing BDS movements being targeted with the kind of threat of being made illegal. Palestinian solidarity in France and Germany being banned altogether, and being challenged actually quite effectively by the social movements, and this kind of obsession around the slogan, "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free." And this is a slogan that is a central slogan since the 1960s of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, and is extremely clear about saying that liberation means a liberation for Palestinians everywhere, wherever they are, and recognizing the kind of the unity, as I was mentioning before, of the Palestinian people from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. And this is being turned on its head in an attempt, I think, to break the solidarity movement by saying that this is not a call for freedom, as the slogan actually makes pretty clear, Palestine will be free, but a call for genocide. And I think in many ways this is a projection, right? Is that the only way in which the Israeli state and its allies can imagine their project is through the elimination of the Palestinians. And so the idea that the Palestinian national movement has, since the 1960s, defended an idea of a democratic secular state for all of its inhabitants, independently of its of their background, is utterly foreign, I think, to our regimes and to our oppressors. And I think it's really important for people to defend that slogan, because it's the defense of a political vision of what we think a solution is. And I think we have to be very confident about that for the moment. We are seeing what the current status quo means. It means either silent oppression in a cage or all-out elimination for the Palestinians. And against that, I think we have to put forward this vision, amplify this vision that the Palestinian national movement had put forward since the 1960s, which is to say there's a different world, a world in which the entire land that is currently controlled by Israel and has been for 65 years, 56 years, can be free for all of its inhabitants, free of military control, free of occupation, free of legal differentiation between people based on their ethnicity or their religion, free of blockades, free of mass murder, and that's the kind of the slogan that we have to hang on to, because it points to a different kind of future that the Palestinians have been fighting for since 1948, and that I think it is our task to support and to fight for in the imperial core.
Thank you for these powerful words, Sai. So we have one final question for Kiki, and anyone else could also jump in. And we have maybe 10 or 15 minutes for question afterward. If anyone in the audience would like to ask question, they can post it on Facebook or YouTube, and we'll get them. So the Global Prison Abolition Coalition really are organized around the question of abolition, not only abolition of prison, but also the police and state violence and patriarchy, and thinking about the ways that community can self-organize autonomously, self-defense, and so on. So our final question is about that abolitionist vision or future. Do you think that's possible in the near future in Palestine and the region? And the prison and security systems are, as you know, central institution, not only in Israel and Palestine, but also the entire Arab Middle Eastern region. What kind of political, social, economic, and cultural strategies are necessary to open the way for that vision, abolitionist vision? And what would an abolitionist or decolonial future in Palestine entail? And I think you answered that question, all of you, in multiple ways throughout this panel. But if you'd like to add.
Thank you for that, for the question on abolition, and also on the question of building an autonomous communities. And I, in LA, we're having this conversation about a general strike, and how is it possible that we could all sustain a general strike is really the question, because we're so inspired, of course, by boycotts, and the Montgomery bus boycott as a historical example is really important, because it wasn't just about not riding the bus, it was also about creating alternatives so that it could be sustained, so that people would not ride the bus. So how do we create alternatives to sustain something like a general strike that really can bring the world from above to its knees, to listen to us and to give us some leverage? And that comes from, that necessarily comes from an abolitionist framework. So when we think about the ways that we are structured in the world of 1492, in the world of empire, which is also the world of capital and patriarchy, we are structured in that closed world of above and below. And this has been talked a lot about from the Black radical tradition, maybe not in those words, but Frantz Fanon, who talked a lot about needing to create a new humanity, a new type of human, because of the human non-human split that dehumanizes. When we think about that above-below dialectic, the root of it is not just a structure of above and below. It is a structure of oppression and domination, exploitation. That is closer to the master-slave dialectic, where there is a superior and an inferior. Something about the world of empire, the logic that we live in, is that every time there's difference, every time we encounter someone different than us, we are taught to rank each other, to rank ourselves vis-a-vis the other, who's superior and who's inferior. And sadly, we learn this in everyday life, largely through schooling, for example, where we're ranked as A, B, C, D, F students. And it's trying, there's a standard for us to meet, a standard of what the good student is. There's a standard for rights. If you're a citizen, if you want to naturalize to have citizenship, if you want a nation state, you need to meet a standard. So rather than a world where we have to meet a standard, how do we create another world where we begin with the assumption that we're already equal? We're equal because we're different. It's not, it's our difference that makes us powerful as collective communities. And what the dominant world is doing is trying to make us all the same. And this is a huge characteristic of the Fourth World Wars. It's trying to make the globe the same. And so when it comes to prisons and incarceration under the Fourth World War, we are surplus populations. So many of us, people who had been useful for capital, and particularly like with the increase of automation, just as one example, it makes the worker less and less protected, and the wage worker then has slipped down below to where closer to where Native Americans and African enslaved peoples have been for a long time. And so what we learned from reading literature from prisoners in particular, because some of them can be some of the sharpest theoreticians on what we're living, is the need to escape, the need to flee, that fugitivity of leaving the above and the below and leaving that world and creating another one. And it doesn't necessarily mean leaving the geography of where we're at, but leaving the world that makes that logic of above and below a system of rewards, a system of rewards to go above. How do we remove those rewards? How do we treat each other in a way where that kind of behavior or relationality isn't what is rewarded, isn't what makes us, human, quote unquote? How do we create that other type of humanity? And so that exit from that world, we learn about it on this hemisphere very strongly from the Maroon societies, or quilombos, which are the runaway enslaved Africans who'd run away from enslavement and create new communities, often with Native Americans and European misfits who also wanted to run away to create another kind of world. So it's necessary. And abolition of that world of empire, of the above and below, abolishing its relevance, its importance in our lives, is necessary for us to leave. We are so dependent, especially those of us who live in cities here in the United States or in Europe. We are so dependent on capitalism. We're so critical of capitalism, and not many of us know how to actually live without it. So in building these autonomous communities where we make it less and less necessary in our lives, and it's creating something out of very little. And this is what so many of our ancestors all over the globe, all over Mother Earth, have done since there have been human beings. How do we do that? Out of necessity for our own ways of living in right relation with Mother Earth, also as a way to have power to ward off that dominant world of above and below that always is going to want to creep up. In order to make this nonviolent, which is the wish we all have, the master needs to step down and just be a person. Because what we have seen in the history of this master-slave dialectic is that when the figure of the slave, of the below wants to run away, the master wants to recapture it because the master is nobody without the slave. The above is not above without the foundation of below. If that below crumbles, if that below escapes, then there's no master, which is fine. Let's not have masters. Why can't we just be people, right? But if we can get to a situation where we can, as many of us who are in above positions, and of course those change according to context in our lives, within one day we can be above and below all kinds of different ways according to context shifts. But if we can all refuse to live in a world where we make our lives at the expense of other lives through this death and destruction, genocide, extermination, repression, exploitation, dispossession, if we can do that, this can be nonviolent. That is going to then depend, right? Like all of us in our own geographies are going to need to see if we can do that, because as we're escaping, we also need to defend ourselves, because the recapture is always going to be necessary for the above to maintain its position as above. And not only just recapture, but actual extermination, incarceration, a way to stabilize that foundation of below for above. So again, to make this nonviolent, and with Palestine, the way to make this nonviolent starting right now is if Israelis decide to stop it. If Israelis decide not in our name anymore. If Israelis decide, yes, let's live another way. They are so traumatized, though. The state has traumatized them so much into believing that Israel has to exist for them to exist. It's this story that they're not safe anywhere else in the world, which from the point of view of Israelis seems true. Where are other alternatives? The whole world seems to run this way. If we could build more and more alternatives, because there is a one world, but there are still many worlds still fighting to stay alive and still fighting to connect into this world where many worlds fit through a web, right? All of us, we in the United States, in anywhere, we're not free. I'm very grateful, Saya, that you mentioned that. Like, we all need to struggle because we're not free. And again, if we can think about how we can sustain a general strike, if we really need to figure out this question of how do we live without capitalism, or how do we live less and less and less and less with capitalism, and less with those bad governments that are totally complicit, and they themselves are genociders too.
Thank you so much, Kiki, for getting us thinking about the alternatives that abolitionists are imagining, because abolition isn't just obviously abolishing settler colonialism and capitalism and violence and genocidal violence at the hands of these, but to be able to imagine and live these alternatives. And I want to leave the floor to Amr and Sai to maybe share their last comments before we end this wonderful conversation.
I would like to add that what we are witnessing now in terms of transnational solidarity is an accumulation. One point of this accumulation was during the Palestinian Second Intifada, when in Durban in South Africa in 2001, like more than 3,000 movements and civil organizations signed a declaration against colonization, racism, slavery, historical colonization, historical slavery, and considered Israel as an apartheid state like South African apartheid, and called for the boycott of Israel to have an international boycott as have been done with the South African apartheid. And at that time, it was the alter globalization or anti-globalization movements and the movements against the war in Iraq. I want to say that to reduce the violence by resistance in Palestine, it needs to put Palestine again as a regional and a global issue. It has emotions and responsibilities in everywhere in the world. It is linked to colonizing states, to Western imperialism. It is linked to regional dictators and like capitalist states. So it is linked to the many struggles of indigenous peoples, of black people, of South Africans, and to reduce this urge for resisting so violently the genocide, because the genocide has been the talk since 2 years, and especially before 1 year after the far right-wing Israeli government, and we were expecting it in the West Bank, or sometimes thinking it will happen in the Palestinians inside the 1948 Palestine. So I think this is important to link these struggles and to go further against the U.S. Israeli genocide in Palestine. And it is really interesting to hear all of you. Thank you so much for this important panel.
Yeah, I mean, if I can maybe continue in that in that thought about how do we think kind of internationally. I think about Palestine, and listening to Kiki, I was also thinking about this idea of how do we think about getting out of the kind of limits that are imposed on us, and the kind of the world of the lines that you kind of talked at the beginning. And I think I was really thinking about the Palestinian left in the 1960s and 70s returned repeatedly to the question that the liberation of Palestine would be part of a wider regional liberation, right? George Habash famously talks about how the road to Jerusalem runs to the capitals of the Arab world. Hassan Kanafani talks about the kind of the enemy trinity, right? So he says it's not just Zionism, it's imperialism, it's the collaborating bourgeoisie in Palestine, it's the Arab regimes that all together establish an infrastructure of control, and it's through international regional movements of collective liberation that we can start talking about the liberation of Palestine. And so to not accept the kind of the nation state and the border, etc., as a unity of as the unit of struggle, but to break through it. And that the analysis also came from the fact that Zionism, the role of Zionism for imperialism, and maybe also what I was trying to say before, was always regional. It still is. It's about Western power in the region as a whole, which is why our governments are prepared to allow Israel to do absolutely everything it wants to the Palestinians as long as it plays that role. And it's also backed by the regimes in Amman and in Cairo and in Riyadh, and that are prepared to normalize, and in the UAE, and that are prepared to normalize and to collaborate and to oppress their own people. And I think we saw in 2011 a little taste of what it looks like to start thinking about liberation beyond the nation state. Is that the people of the region that took to the streets, whether it was in Syria or in Yemen or in Tunisia or in Libya or in Egypt, etc., all made the link between their liberation from their repressive regimes and the liberation the Palestinians, and we're seeing it again as the masses are returning to the streets. They are making the connection not only for the liberation of Palestine, but also for their own. So in Egypt, we saw the first demonstrations in 2013, since the counter-revolution, breaking back into Tahrir, chanting not only for the freedom of Palestine, but also demanding bread, social justice, and freedom, as they had done in 2011. The masses in Jordan have forced the Hashemites, which have to be the lowest of the low of an already rotten barrel of reactionary regimes in the region, to stand up, however timidly, to the Americans under the kind of popular pressure. And so I think we're getting a small taste, despite the kind of horror that is playing itself out in front of us. We're getting a small taste of what the Palestinian left already talked about in the 60s and 70s, which is that it's not by reproducing the existing structures and borders and states, but by positioning the possibility of their destruction of a different kind of world, that Palestine and the world that surrounds it can be free. And I think we have to hold on to that image and to that struggle in our own organizing as well.
Yeah, I began by bringing up how, when you follow Palestine long enough, you realize it's a problem of the world and not just of Palestine or of Jews and Arabs. And so I want to, just as final remarks, just point out to some shifts, some ruptures that we're witnessing. And one of them is that the isolation of the Palestinians is no more. This has been Zionism's tactic for a very long time, or strategy even. It's huge, is to isolate the Palestinian resistance for Palestine from the region, which is what we were seeing on the eve of October 7, on September 22nd, when Netanyahu went to the United Nations and showed a set of maps, and one of them showed that iconic shape of Palestine all filled in, and it said Israel. So Palestine had been wiped off the map. And then his next map was all of the shaded countries that were now friends with Israel, including Saudi Arabia, which was about to sign a pact or a normalization deal with Israel. And he brings out his red marker, Netanyahu, and he draws a pipeline from the Gulf to the Mediterranean through Palestine, through Akka, which has been in the plan since the Sykes-Picot secret agreement to cut up Palestine. A little bit of that port of Palestine, where Akka and Haifa are, were going to be purely for the British for these pipelines. And so it is regional, it is global. And what we're seeing right now is that with October 7th, the whole world now is talking about the Palestinian plight after it had been going ignored for the last couple of years, especially as things have heightened. There is an opportunity right now, with so many of the paths that the Palestinians have been clearing, and particularly the resistance has cleared with October 7, for us to all recognize how it is a world problem, and how it affects what we do affects Palestine as well. And not just for Palestine, also this question about our own liberation, Palestinian liberation, Jewish liberation, which Israel has never been a solution to, and for all of our liberation. So this is a moment, I think, as the contradictions are just clearing up, and I know that there's a lot of heartbreak going on, and it can be very painful to recognize there's so many betrayals, and also to recognize how normalized fascism is around people that we love. These are all opportunities for us to understand that more, not agree with it, understand it critically being recognizing what the assumptions are of something, not just saying I don't like this, but what are the assumptions of that, and seeing if we're cool with those assumptions, and maybe we want to create other assumptions. And more concretely, usually we start with the assumption of freedom as a nation state, as that bordered Palestine, right? As that bordered anything. Is that really the assumption that we want to start with? Or maybe we want to create other shared assumptions so that we can get to this place where we really can have a world where all people can live. All people can live as all people are in all of our difference, a world where many worlds fit, rather than just a world where everyone can live, where everyone has to be the same, has to be acceptable to the above in order to be able to even exist. So I'll leave my thoughts there. Hopefully, I'm actually optimistic and even hopeful for the future. It's not yet written, but the openings that we're seeing right now are enormous, and it's going to be up to us to see how we write that future. So it's exciting to see so many people learning so fast, even if they didn't know before about Palestine, and how far more sophisticated folks are than when I was first learning about it. And like someone said the other day that what's been learned about Palestine in these last 50 days has been like 10 years worth, because so much heart is being put into trying to understand what's happening, not just in Palestine, but all around us, and the bad governments that lead us, unfortunately. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you for such a fascinating debate, discussion, and your remark, Kiki, that people are really educating themselves. The more violence the Israeli military is using against Palestinians, the more people are educating themselves and understanding that long history. Thank you to all three panelists for really letting us think the meaning of abolition in the context of Palestine, help us understand better the question of settler colonialism, and expand our understanding of the possibilities. It's true that there is so much violence right now, but I think this is also a turning point, and there are possibilities, and there are other ways of being and becoming. And thank you so much for our ASL interpreter, Ryan, for doing such a fascinating work for almost 2 hours now. Thank you so much. And I would like also to thank our sponsors, Jewish Voices for Peace, Pittsburgh, DSA Boston, Muslim Counter Publics Lab, and Student for Justice in Palestine, Emerson. And please visit our website. We'll have more panels in the coming weeks. And apologies to Ammar, who is in Beirut, and I think it's almost midnight right now. So apologies for keeping you up until now. Thank you, everyone.